One of the arguments against the site of the temple just south of the Temple Mount, so on this location here, is that this site is too small for the temple, allegedly. Now, in a previous video, I already did point out that the site here is comparable to the St. Peter's Square as well as to the site in Mecca. If you project the temple site, the proposed temple site on the St. Peter's Square or on the site around the Kaaba in Mecca, then it is clear that those areas are of comparable size. So it wasn't probably what they meant when they comment that the site was too small, but it gives you some perspective. The place is actually quite large. Now, many pictures do show a large temple, but what was actually the size of the temple? Now, the first book of Kings, chapter 6, described Salomons Temple, and that is about 10 meters wide and 30 meters long, this building here. And that is exactly the same ratio as the tabernacle described in Exodus chapter 26, that has also a 1:3 ratio. And the dimensions of the court of the tabernacle are given, also in the ratio 1:3, but the dimensions of the court of Solomon's Temple aren't mentioned in the Bible, but also there a ratio of 1:3 is to be expected. Now, the second temple that was built by Zerubbabel was built upon the foundations of the first 70 years later, after its destruction. And that is being described in the book of Ezra. And given the disappointment of those who had seen Solomon's Temple, it is safe to assume that the second temple wasn't bigger than the first one. Now, this second temple was thoroughly renovated by King Herod, and when you read Josephus, Herod did rebuild it more impressive than it was, but mainly in its height. There is no reason to think that Herod changed the footprint of the temple. Maybe except for this portico here. Reading Josephus, you get the impression that this portico was extended to this width here, so it was in front of the whole building, and its height was increased above the temple. So that was the only change in the footprint of the temple as far as Josephus and Herod are concerned. Now, if you look at the premises here on the proposed temple site just south of Fortress Antonia, the so-called Temple Mount, then the measures of the temple are given here, and that is actually the size of Solomon's Temple, extended by our friend Herod. And that is a footprint of about 20 by 45 meters. And that is based on the Bible and on Josephus, and not based on tales told 200 years after its destruction. The size of the inner court isn't given, the size of the inner court, so this here. But as I said before, it can be assumed that the ratio 1:3 was still there. And as you see, this size fits the altar and the copper sea, and the proportions of the site seems to fit. Now, the process that was taking place, that was the process that was going on at the inner court, required space, quite a lot of space actually, and the question is how much? Now, we can get a sense of that from the space around the tabernacle. that seems to have been about 1200 square meter. That is being described in Exodus chapter 26, and I will give a link, by the way, to all the references in the description. And if you compare the tabernacle to Salomons Temple, several measures were doubled from the tabernacle to Salomons Temple. Now, maybe the area as well. That would be then, in that case, 2400 square meter. In fact, that is the picture what is seen here. The area here around the temple is 2400 square meter. And I think that this space was enough for the process that was going on there. And I'll give you the assumptions in a minute, on which I did base myself for the idea that this space is enough. And the reasoning I followed was the following. What is the number of people living in the greater Jerusalem, was my question. And what is a reasonable ratio between the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the number of pilgrims? And I estimated, based on the surface area and average population density figures, that about 15,000 people could live within the walls of Jerusalem. And I assumed that about the same number of people were living around Jerusalem within a Sabbath's journey. And that led to a number slightly more than 30,000 in the greater Jerusalem. And that is, as far as I'm concerned, an upper limit, because I included the fact that this quarter here was already in existence, while this was only being the case in the second half of the 1st century. Now, for a reasonable ratio between inhabitants and pilgrims, I took a ratio of 1 to 3, so 3 pilgrims on every inhabitant of Jerusalem, and that led to a number of 100,000 pilgrims. The second thing I did was to take this number of 100,000 to estimate and calculate what that number would have meant for the traffic in the city and the level of traffic congestion. The calculation was based on an estimation of the total length of the main road system, which did not exceed 5 kilometers. You can make an estimation of the main road system within Jerusalem, and of course there are a lot of smaller roads as well, but that is the main road system. And then you can guess the percentage of people on the move on the same time, and you can guess which percentage of people is on the main road instead of on the small streets in Jerusalem. And those guesses led to a number of 4 people per meter street. So for every meter street there were 4 people, and with a width of the street 3, 4, maybe 5 meters, it did indicate that 100,000 pilgrims is close to the upper limit from a traffic perspective. Now, the third thing I did was to have a look at the capacity in the city for everybody to perform a ritual bathing before going to the temple. All those people who came to Jerusalem to visit the temple did spend some time at the side of a pool, occupying a certain length at that side of the pool. Putting their sandals and their garments there, or sitting down to wash their feet, or whatever they did there. And there are white margins here on how much time they spent actually on that side of the pool, and how many pools were there apart from those we still know. And maybe there were places along the aqueducts where you can perform this ritual as well. But regardless these margins, this ritual bathing capacity is also a limiting factor in the city. And also from this perspective, 100,000 pilgrims as an upper limit doesn't feel far off if you do the calculation. Now the last consideration was about the Roman procurator and his sense of security with only one Roman legion on standby. And what is a reasonable balance between the size of the crowd and the size of the policing forces? Now, the second step was to take this number of pilgrims, the 100,000, and try to calculate what this would mean for the floor space requirements needed to perform all the sacrifices. Wood storage, for instance, in terms of cubics, in terms of volume, slaughter capacity, in surface area, and labor in terms of time. Now, the estimation was that in order to sacrifice these animals, close to 2,000 per day in that case, requires about 500 square meter, which takes one side of the temple. If we go back to this picture here, then 500 square meters is about the area which you have available on just the south side of the temple here. So that is this area here. This area here is roughly about 500 square meter. And the fire, if you make the calculation, could consume about 200 cubic meter of wood during such a day. Well, that relates to a storage capacity of wood of at least 1,000 cubic meter on the other side of the temple, so here on the north side. And it would take about 175 priests on site to perform these services. Mainly working on that side, but a substantial number as well on the other side to maintain the fire. Now, I suspect there were subterranean cisterns on this side as well in order to wash the intestines and to store skins. And I will come back on that in a future video, why I do think that, and on the indications we have for that to be true. Now, the main conclusion of all of this of this estimation and this calculation was that the process would fit this size. Now, the surface area around the temple, so we are talking now about the surface area here, so that is this whole premises excluding the temple itself, is about 18,600 square meter, and this side here is about 11,000 square meters. So in total here we have close to 30,000 square meters, and with 100,000 pilgrims all wanting to stay for an hour or so in this area, rejoicing in the Lord and admiring the buildings and being impressed by the flames of the altar, and enjoying the view of the Kidron Valley while waiting for their meat. At least some of them are waiting for that. So maybe it's even more than 1 hour. But if you assume that every pilgrim wants to stay for 1.5 hours in this area, we are talking about 12 to 13,000 people here, and that is 2.5 square meter per person. Now that is somewhat crowded, but it is doable for sure. So with regard to the temple and temple area here, it might be even possible to push the limits of the capacity 25% up by increasing the inner court slightly with 25% and squeezing slightly more persons on this temple square of this area here for having 2 square meters per person, which is still possible. Then the limiting factor is in fact the city and not the temple. Now we could of course look at this side here where the conventional wisdom put the temple, namely on the Temple Mount, and the capacity of the temple and the temple area could be 3 to 4 times as high, so could handle 350 pilgrims per day. But that isn't going to work for the city, especially when you consider that this city, which I did use for my calculation, did include Bethsaida as well, but that wasn't even there further back in time, and even this quarter here was a later addition. So the 350,000 pilgrims per day, which you can handle here on this side here, is out of proportion with the capacity of the city itself. Now, and apart from the fact that I already was impressed by the burn rate of 200 kilos of wood per minute in a 100,000 pilgrims scenario. So the burn rate would go up to a 600 kilo of wood per minute if you have to prepare meat for 350,000 people. And have you ever tried to imagine what it would be like a temple square the size of 2 or 3 red squares from Moscow? With the height of the structures and the cloisters around it 3 times as low as the Kremlin and the other buildings around the Red Square, and then on top of a mountain. Imagine that. It would certainly give a desolate feeling, and it is, in my opinion, unhuman-megalomanic, out of proportion. If you have the imagination to see a temple square here with these proportions. Now, and that is hard to imagine that to be built when humanity hardly left the Bronze Age. Before we have a quick look at my assumptions in the spreadsheet, I know people will point to the number of pilgrims Josephus is mentioning, and I will come back on Josephus and discuss what the monkey was on his shoulder when he was writing his book in a future video. Now I will give you a quick look at the spreadsheet, which was on the basis of it. I estimated the population density. I came up with a population figure. I doubled it for the greater Jerusalem. I estimated a pilgrim inhabitants ratio. And then I had a look at the traffic situation with the length of the main road system and the percentage of people, etc. on the move. And then I came up with the aforementioned 4 people per square meter, which is quite crowded. Then I'll have to look at the ritual washing capacity of the city with the number of pools and the average length of the pools and time it takes for every pilgrim to wash himself and how much meter he was occupying during that ritual washing. And I came up with some figures as well, which had an 50% occupation rate, but that was based on a 12-hour day, while in reality people want to have washed themselves before midday, is my guess. So then you have then with 100,000 you have an occupation rate of 100%. Now a Roman legion would give you this distribution of people, or this ratio of people, which sounds okay to me with 100,000. And then I try to calculate what is required in the temple based on the number of cows and sheep and sparrows being slaughtered over there to give the amount of meat for everybody to have a meal based on a 1 kilo per person. Gives you 100,000 kilos. And well, how much, what is the meat yield for all those animals? How much time does it take to prepare it? And what is the length of the stay on premises of these animals? And that will lead you to a space required, as well as a total labor content. And if you then assume that the priest was working for 6 hours, because it was heavy duty work, that will bring you to the number of priests on site and the priest necessary to perform this service in a day. And if you estimate the ratio between the wood and the amount of stuff that is being burned, then you will come up with a number of cubic meters or kilos of wood. And if you calculate that, you can do that per minute. So that was basically what I did there. And it's guesswork, but it gives you an order of magnitude. And I did also have a look at the specifics of the Pesach ritual, potentially the biggest festival of all. That with this festival, sheep were roasted in one piece, which would have reduced the labor content. You don't have to butcher it. And it would have resulted in reduced staying time at the premises. Now, both are true, but in the calculation it didn't result in reduced space requirement or in reduced labor content, for the simple reason that when you only have sheep involved and no cows, and in order to have the same amount of meat, the number of animals being offered has to go up with 1,200. And again, we are talking here about the 100,000 pilgrim scenario. Now, for this Pesach festival with only sheep, the space requirements goes even up from 500 to 600 square meter, and the number of priests on site occupied in this process goes up from 175 to 200. It's still doable in the imagined site here, but the wood consumption decimated in that scenario. There was way less to burn in the temple with this festival. As I said, I will come back on my assessment of the reliability of Josephus, or if I haven't said that, I have now. I will come back on the reliability of Josephus. Thank you for listening.